Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Differentiating with the Science of Reading, Doing Away with Leveled Readers with Dr. Timothy Shanahan. My name is Lauren Brenner, and I'm a marketing manager at Amplify. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll email out the recording link for you to rewatch as you like. And everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance. We have a live captioner with us today, so if you want to access the captions, click on Live Transcript in the bottom tray. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end of the presentation. We welcome comments in the chat, and to start, let's find out where everyone is joining us from today and what your role in education is. I'm joining you today from Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia. I'm sure we have people from all over the world joining us today, and we're so glad that everyone is here with us. And just a quick note too, that we are hosting an entire week of literacy data webinars. So if you haven't already signed up for more, please do. Later today at 12 p.m. Eastern, we have a presentation by our own Alessia Flores Menendez and Kajal Patel Bilo to present Differentiating with the Science of Reading, Supporting Multilingual Learners. And we'll be closing out our wonderful week tomorrow with a presentation by Dr. Gina Biancarosa, Beyond K-2, Data for the upper elementary and middle school grades. To find out about the other webinars and watch recordings of past webinars in the series, visit amplify.com/data takeover week. And one of my colleagues will put that link in the chat as well. And thank you again for joining us today. We're so excited to have Dr. Timothy Shanahan with us today. Dr. Shanahan is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was founding director of the UIC Center for Literacy. He is author-editor of more than 200 publications on literacy education. His research emphasizes the connections between reading and writing, literacy in the disciplines, and improvements of reading achievement. He is past president of the International Literacy Association and served as a member of the advisory board of the National Institute for Literacy under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and helped lead the National Reading Panel convened at the request of Congress to evaluate research on teaching reading, a major influence on reading education. He also chaired the National Literacy Panel for Language Minority Children and Youth and the National Early Literacy Panel, and helped write the Common Core State Standards. Welcome, Dr. Shanahan. How are you? We're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm happy to be here. Thanks to Amplify for inviting me to be part of Literacy Data Takeover Week. I'm happy to be here.
We're so glad you could join us. I am going to now turn the screen sharing over to you.
Okay, thank you. This is the part, ladies and gentlemen, where all of our Amplify friends are going to get nervous because I'm going to start hitting some buttons and we're going to see what happens. I hope nothing blows up. Or let's see. Here we go. We're getting closer. And now I've got to do one of those and one of those, and I think we are set to go.
Looks great.
Today's sermon is about teaching kids with more complex text and doing away with leveled readers. I mean, the whole idea of leveled readers is a fairly old one in American education. That the purpose of it was to differentiate, to try to meet the needs of more kids, and which is great, except that we're finding it's actually holding a lot of kids back. And so we're going to really do this in kind of two parts today. My plan is this: the first part of my presentation, I'm going to try to make all the kind of research-based claims and explain sort of why people are trying to move to more complex text and what that entails and what the research has to say about it. And then I want to move into giving you a lot of practical examples of real life teaching moves. And I probably have about 3,000 slides here, so there's no way I'm going to get through my entire list of those kinds of examples, but I'm going to do it right up until we kind of run out of time, and we'll stop and take some questions at that point. So if you have questions, you can put them into the chat, and Lauren, I guess, will compile those. So that's the plan. So I won't just sort of endlessly get to go on and give you examples of instruction, but I will just right up until we run out of time. So a little history lesson first. Back in the 19th century, 1830s, 40s, American education really creates for us the graded school, an idea that comes out of Europe. Instead of having kids just in a classroom, with a teacher and everybody at different ages and different abilities and so on, they have this idea of organizing children by age. And textbook publishers come along and start providing textbooks with the idea of one per grade level. And, you get the really first very strong differentiation of reading instruction in the United States. This was supposed to improve literacy because it was going to reduce the amount of variation that each teacher had to handle. And it offered some clear benefits. But by the end of the 19th century, it was really clear to teachers and other educators that despite the fact that these children were organized by ages and that a lot of the variation had been taken care of, there was still dramatic differences among children in every classroom. And so throughout the first 30 or 40 years of the 20th century, there was a search across the nation, some of it in academia, but most of it in school systems, of people trying to come up with schemes for how can we differentiate. And usually that involves some kind of testing and regrouping of kids and so on and so forth. There we go. The approach that caught on was one that was put forth by a reading professor by the name of Emmett Betts. Betts came up with kind of the major teacher education textbook of his era. And he had the idea that what teachers should do is test children with informal reading inventories, which have morphed now into curriculum-based measurement and running records and things like that. Matching kids to text based on their reading ability as identified by those informal tests, and then teaching kids in homogeneous groups where, this kid is going to work in first semester of second grade books and his buddies are going to be over in second semester, second grade, and these other kids will be at the third grade book and so on. And so what Betts claimed is if you did this, you would get much higher reading achievement, that this would optimize learning. And in fact, his scheme was that we all have three reading levels: an independent level. You've all been trained in this, I believe. An independent level, instructional level, frustration level. The numbers that I have on this screen are the criteria that he set. That, when you tested those kids, when you listened to them read text, you would decide that they were instructional in that particular text if they could recognize 95 to 98% of the words, if they could comprehend and answer 75 to 89% of the questions. Betts' notion was that was going to be the right level to teach kids at. Now, over the years, there have been all kinds of arguments about this, almost from the beginning. And so you'll see folks saying, no, fluency isn't 95%, it's 94%. These days, probably some of the more popular schemes are saying 90%. But as you'll see, they just have been making these numbers up for the most part. But the idea was if you taught kids at those instructional levels, whatever that instructional level is, you would get better learning. If you taught them at the frustration level, you were really going to stop learning from happening, or you would really slow it down. Now, there have been, all kinds of schemes put forth since Betts, but they're all really based on his work. Probably the most popular one these days is Faunis and Pinnell's version of guided reading, which is really a lot of Betts' ideas made modern, made to fit, some of our conditions and some of the possibilities that we have in American schools today. But surveys of teachers and so on show that something like 75% of teachers are grouping their kids for instruction in this way. So this is a very common way to teach in the United States. is there any research evidence that this is a good idea? And this is where it gets, to me, very interesting. And I can tell you, when I was a classroom teacher, I taught first grade and third grade in the elementary schools. I always grouped my kids. I always tested my kids every year at the beginning to find their instructional level. So, I've done that. And I was stunned to find out what the research actually had to say about it. Now, Bett's original idea, he explains in his textbook, really came from a study done by one of his doctoral students during World War II. This was a study that I had always assumed what they had done is place some kids at their instructional level and left other kids, getting the kind of instruction that whatever their school was doing, and compared them somehow and found that teaching kids at the instructional level gave a benefit. And I was surprised, I was shocked to find when I was working on my doctoral studies that Kilgallen hadn't done that kind of a study, that what Betts was saying really, I think, was misleading. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. But essentially what Kilgallen did is took a small group of fourth graders and he had them read text aloud and answer questions about those texts. And he looked to see at how many oral reading errors the boys and girls were able to make and still answer 70% of the questions at that time. And that was 75% of the questions at that time. And so it was just looking for how many mistakes can you make and still comprehend the text. No concerns about learning at all. No concerns about whether kids would get better working with that. The assumption was that as long as kids could comprehend the text reasonably well, they'd learn from it. They'd get better at their reading. But they didn't test that idea. It was just a belief. In the 1960s, a professor named Powell decided that he liked the idea of the instructional level. He even thought that Bett's notion of testing the kids in this way made sense, but he thought they got the numbers wrong. He thought he got those criteria wrong. And so what Powell did is tested a much larger group of students, grades 1 through 8, in a series of studies. And what he found was that, frankly, there wasn't a single instructional level. There were multiple instructional levels at different grade levels. And kids were able to comprehend text and still make a lot of oral reading errors. In fact, in the primary grades, he thought that they could make like 15 mistakes per 100 words, not 5, and still get pretty good comprehension. And so his claim was that Betts had done it all right. He just got the wrong numbers, and that if we were teaching reading in the best way possible, we'd actually be putting kids in books that were somewhat harder. One of Powell's students, Dunkel, did a really interesting study. It's not an experiment, but he looked at real classrooms, second grades. He went in and saw how what levels the teachers had matched kids to books, and he tested all of those kids to see how hard those books were for them. And he calculated the accuracy that they could read it with in terms of the words and the comprehension. And then he monitored the kids' learning through the school year to see who made the most learning and how did that work out. And what he was finding is that the children who were learning the most, who made the biggest learning gains from their instruction, had originally been reading text that was 80 to 85% accurate. So frustration level by Bett's notion, and someplace around 50% in terms of reading comprehension. And so again, wow, those are levels that teachers have been told avoid. And what Dunkel was saying is those are the levels that kids made the greatest gains. Another study, this one done by Jorgensen and his colleagues, looked at third, fourth, and fifth grade boys, found absolutely no relationship between whether those kids were placed at frustration level, instructional level, or independent level, and the amount of learning that they did. It was just irrelevant in that study. It's not until the year 2000, more than 50 years after Betts tells us that you have to do it in this particular way, that somebody decides, let's test this by an experiment. Let's actually teach some kids at their frustration level. Let's teach some kids at their instructional level, and let's see what happens. And so in this study, they take second graders. The children are tested. They find out what their levels are, and then they randomly assign these children to groups that are either going to work with text at their instructional level. So let's say we've tested these kids, and let's say somebody's reading at a first grade level. If they're reading at a first grade level, Morgan sticks that, 1/3 of the group gets stuck in the first grade level. They're going to work with books at that level. If they're reading at first grade level, another place they might randomly get assigned is to work with a third grade book. So they're going to be working with a book 2 grade levels above their reading level, or they're going to be working with a book 4 grade levels above the reading level. Now, we all know how this is supposed to come out. The kids who are being taught at their instructional level are supposed to make the biggest gains. The kids in those harder texts are not going to do very well. That's the notion. Well, Brown does this, and they provide instruction for some length of time, come back and test. And what they found is all the groups made some gains. So learning happened for everybody. The biggest learning gains came for those kids who were placed 2 years above their instructional level, 2 grade levels above their instructional level. The group that was placed 4 levels did better than the instructional level group. They didn't do as well as the group that was 2 years above level, but they did actually about halfway in between the two groups. Brown found that it was better to be at the frustration level than to be at the instructional level. Now that, I'm missing oh no, there it is right at the bottom there. Brown replicates this study with third graders and finds exactly the same thing. There are some studies done by O'Connor with children who are at they have IEPs. They're considered learning disabled. These were, again, I believe these are third, fourth, and fifth grade children. And what they found was she did 2 studies. One gets cited a lot, one gets ignored. The first one is kind of a flawed study, but she found that at least for the lowest reading children, the children who were like beginning readers, they were that far back, were benefited by being taught with their instructional level materials, but she didn't find any benefits for the kids who were beyond that beginning level. And when she replicated this study and tried to clean up the problems that had happened in the first one, she found absolutely no benefit from placing kids. These are learning disabled kids. Teaching them with grade level materials was every bit as effective as teaching them with the materials that, well, frankly, segregate those kids from their classmates and give them less opportunity to be exposed to content and so on. Melanie Kuhn and her colleagues do a series of studies where they compare in classroom instruction, where they teach children either with grade level text or they get compared with guided reading, where of course everybody's placed at their level. And they found much bigger gains from having kids working with the grade level materials. Homan and her colleagues tried teaching 6th graders either with instructional level text or text a year above that, and found absolutely no benefit from being at the instructional level text. Sarah Lupo does a study with ninth graders. This says no learning benefit. That's not quite right. The second language learners, the newcomers, this is ninth grade. The kids who are really extremely low in English did find a benefit from the easier text, but none of the other kids did, including kids who were below grade level. Essentially, what I just did is took you through all the research on this, and what this study after study has found is either placing kids at their instructional level is giving no benefit, or frankly, it's holding them back to some extent. That's kind of upsetting. My experiences in school, this slide is not from research, it's from experience. I've been teaching and visiting classrooms and observing and doing studies in classrooms and so on for more than 50 years. And here's what I think happens when kids start running into trouble with the books, when they start struggling to read the books at all. Teachers do one of four things. They either do what Betts recommended, which is move kids to an easier text, a text where they're going to have pretty high word recognition and pretty high comprehension from the start. Or, teachers get frustrated and they read the text to the students because the kids struggle with it. Or they tell, especially in the upper grades, I'm not going to have you read the science book. I'll just tell you what you have to know from it for the test, and you don't have to read it. Or in some cases, they just ignore the fact that kids aren't getting it. And I don't think any of those are great. What we really need to do is place kids in text that they can't read easily without help, and then teach them how to read those books. That's how they're going to get better and stronger. The instructional level idea really argues for that, but then places kids in text that they can read so well that there's very little opportunity to learn. Can we just throw kids into difficult text? And I think this is where people really push back against the idea of teaching with complex text. They see that kids are struggling with the text and they don't know what to do about it. But there are a number of studies showing that if we scaffold kids' learning, that they can do pretty well with more difficult text. But you can't just throw them in. I really argue for a very different definition of reading and reading achievement than what a lot of us have. I know in a lot of instructional programs, people are working their tails off teaching kids how to answer main idea questions and supporting details questions. And, I want a question that looks like standard number 5 and all that kind of thing. But that's really not what reading is. Reading is the ability to read and understand text, to negotiate the conceptual, linguistic, and textual affordances and barriers included in a text. Authors provide clues to meaning, and good readers are able to identify those clues and to make sense of them. Unintentionally, perhaps, authors put barriers to our understanding as well. Sometimes they use words we don't understand, or sometimes they'll, trying to be elegant, perhaps, they convey their ideas in a complicated sentence that makes it hard to understand. You have to be able to get over those barriers. You have to be able to conquer those. And so teaching kids to read isn't having them practice answering certain kinds of questions. It's teaching them to figure out these aspects of text and learning how to negotiate those. A basic premise of instructional level theory is that we minimize teaching, since learning comes from successful practice. I was just reading a textbook for teachers yesterday, and it was, if you just get kids reading in the classroom, everything's going to be fine. Research doesn't really agree with that. The basic premise of complex text theory is that readers can make even more learning progress if taught how to deal with the conceptual and linguistic barriers of text that they can't already read well. The point of instruction should be to maximize learning, not just to hope that kids figure it out themselves. Now, I want to I've made I hope, a strong argument for the idea of teaching with complex text, but I also now want to take a little of that back because I think that at this stage there has to be an important exception, and that's for beginning readers. All the research studies that I shared with you are from grades 2nd through 9th grade. There are no such studies with beginning readers, so that should give us some caution. There are some studies that would suggest at least the possibility that it's different with beginning readers because of their need to learn basic decoding. I mean, let's face it, what makes a beginning instructional text hard for kids is the words. And so you want kids to be able to see word patterns and hear certain words over and over again so that they recognize those words easily. And making text more complicated means giving them a higher vocabulary load, a less consistent decoding basis, and so on, which doesn't speed kids along. It's more likely to slow them down. We want beginners taught with relatively simple text that they can read easily, but read easily because of the amount of word repetition and the degree of decodability. And so initially, we worry about these levels. We worry about matching kids to text that matches up with their word recognition abilities, their decoding abilities. Once they've accomplished, say, a high first grade ability to decode, then we don't have to worry about that so much. We can give kids at least some of their texts, more complicated text, more demanding text. Well, that's the wrong heading, but for grade 2 and up, students will have the greatest opportunity to learn by working with text they cannot already comprehend well. Instead of selecting books for instruction, because the students can read it, provide books they need assistance with, and then you provide that assistance and that practice. Are there studies showing that you can actually scaffold kids to higher reading levels and so on? And in fact, this whole list of studies does that, as does this one. There's lots of research showing that that's possible. With that, I want to move into showing you examples for the next 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll jump into some questions. But I can't show you all of these today, and I don't intend to, but I'd like to show you some of them. If you look at this list, there are all kinds of ways that we can make sense of a text that's hard for us. Certainly one of those things is to bring our prior knowledge to it, and we can scaffold kids' use of their prior knowledge. We can deal with vocabulary. If I come to a word I don't know, I have a number of things I can do to figure that out. The same can be said if you come to a text that has complicated syntax. We can teach kids how to break down sentences or how to identify elements that will help them to understand it. And coherence and genre and text organization and author's tone and the use of literary devices and charts and all the graphics and things like that. We can teach kids to deal with all of those, but the only way you're going to do that successfully is by having kids confront those in text, stub their toes on them, and then show them how to deal with it. Now, there are some other instructional supports that are needed as well, at least in some cases. I think maybe the knottiest problem for most teachers is, some of the kids are still, they might have basic decoding down, but they're still struggling with the words. They can't read this text fluently. And, there are definitely some things we can do there. And there were things done in those studies to build up kids' fluency with these texts that they struggle with. And in fact, the fluency research says you teach fluency most effectively when the kids can't already read the text fluently. So starting with text that kids have pretty high fluency with is a bad idea if you want to increase this. And obviously there's some other things here we can do. So let's just look at some examples of what I'm talking about. Prior knowledge is really an important part of making sense of things. I think it was David Pearson's definition of comprehension as building bridges between the new and the known. The new being the information in the text, and the known being what the reader brings to the text. Readers don't just take in information; we interpret it through the lens of what we already know. Text can be challenging if the author thinks that we know certain things and expects us to be able to use that knowledge, and we don't have it. And so students can be guided to use their related experiences in ways that scaffolds the new knowledge. Now, I think we do a lot of this. I don't think we do this very well, to tell you the truth. I think at times we overdo it. Just talking to Natalie Wexler yesterday, we were emailing back and forth, and one of the things that I think teachers perseverate on a lot of times is when they're trying to build prior knowledge that they think is relevant to a text. A lot of times they tell the kids what the text is going to say. That's not what we mean by prior knowledge being used in a text. We want kids to use what they know to get at the new information. If all you do is tell them the new information ahead of time, you make the reading unnecessary, and you certainly make it possible for the youngster to look like he comprehended when he didn't comprehend at all. So we've got to not overdo that prior knowledge thing. We also have a tendency to front load too much with it. Oh, gee, we're going to read something about the U.S. Civil War. I think, we're going to, watch 3 videos, and, I'm going to talk for half an hour about Abraham Lincoln, and now we'll be ready to read it. We put too much up front. In that 9th grade study I told you that Sarah Lupo did, and another study that she and her colleagues did, they actually got the kids building those connections between what was in the text and what they knew as they read, not just at the beginning. And so as they were reading each idea, they were trying to connect that. Do I already know about that? What do I know about that? Gee, that's new. Do I understand that kind of thing? And getting kids to look for similarities and differences as they work through a text, not before they work through the text. So that would give you some sense. Oh, okay. So when kids are doing reading that I think is going to be hard, I want to make sure that they have maximum opportunity to bring to bear what they already know on that. And if there are pieces of information that would be useful, but that the author isn't going to reveal, I'm going to maybe front load that kind of information, make that available to them. So let's jump to another category. Vocabulary supports. Text can be hard because of unfamiliar vocabulary. Kids, even if they have a good working vocabulary for conversation and getting by in their social lives, might not have the academic vocabulary they're going to need to read science or social studies or quality literature or any of that kind of thing. And so vocabulary, I think vocabulary is the most obvious gap between people and text when it comes to comprehension. We have really 2 goals, it seems to me, when it comes to vocabulary. One is we want to teach kids vocabulary. We want to build up the amount of vocabulary they carry around in their lexicon, in their head. The more words kids learn, the less chance that vocabulary is going to be a barrier for them when they view something or read something. But you have a second notion of vocabulary in academic learning, and that is there are times I honestly don't care whether the youngster learns the meaning of a particular word and retains it forever. What I'm really going for right now is I just want him to understand that word well enough right now that he can understand this particular text today. I think we spend too much time on building lexicon and not enough on paying attention to those circumstances when we just want to remove the barrier or have kids surmount the barrier of vocabulary when they're reading. If my purpose is not to build that lexicon, but to enable successful comprehension, instruction has to shift a little bit. Now, I'm not saying building the lexicon isn't important. We definitely want to do that, but that's not all we want to do. And so we have to shift a bit. I think the first thing I would say is we often focus on words that we think are important in life. This is a word that's going to come up again and again. If you're a high school teacher, might be a word that you think is going to be come up on the SAT or the ACT, and it might help your kids get into college or whatever. And that's a very reasonable thing to do if you're trying to teach vocabulary. But that means we ignore words that aren't terribly important in terms of their general use, but they're words that disrupt the kids' understanding of this particular text, and we're not doing very much with it. And I think that's a mistake. We need to identify words that students are not likely to know or that can't be figured out easily that may have high impact on comprehension, no matter their general value. And second, I'm not going to try to teach those words thoroughly, but I'm going to aim for some minimal but sufficient familiarization or support. Now, let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. I've swiped this out of somebody's fourth grade textbook, and I'm not criticizing the textbook, but my point is this. If you look at this particular science passage, photosynthesis may sound like a big word, but it's actually pretty simple. You can divide it into two parts. Photo is the Greek word for light, and synthesis is the Greek word for putting together, which explains what photosynthesis is. It's using light to put things together. You may have noticed that all animals and humans eat food, but plants don't eat anything. Photosynthesis is how plants, and it goes on and explains the process of photosynthesis. This particular textbook recommends that the teacher pre-teach some words from this text so that the youngster will comprehend it well. I have no problem with that. That can be very sensible to pre-teach some vocabulary to enable kids to handle the text. My problem in this particular case is that the word they want you to pre-teach is photosynthesis. The whole point of reading this passage and the next page is to learn what photosynthesis is. If you tell kids what photosynthesis is before they have to try to figure it out from this explanation, you just miss the whole point of teaching this aspect of science reading, of being able to get the definition and be able to connect it to the other ideas they're going to have to. I have no problem if you decide, gee, I don't think the kids are going to know what process is or synthesis is. So I want to talk about that. But photosynthesis in this case is defined in the text and it shouldn't be pre-taught. That would be an example of, gee, we want to make sure they get photosynthesis instead of we want to make sure kids can read this kind of text effectively. Another similar example. Some scientists argued that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. I've highlighted three words. These weren't highlighted by the publisher of this fifth grade passage, but it seems to me that there's a chance that kids could get one, two, or three of those words, not because they necessarily know what they mean already, but because of context. I think there's some clues to what a glacier is when it tells you that they melt and that when they melt, sea levels rise. That gives us some idea that they might be ice. That gives us some idea that they might be especially large. Oil from spills often seeps into the oceans. Kids might not know what seeps means, but they very well might get it from that particular sentence. And so I would argue against pre-teaching words like glaciers or seeps. I want those to be comprehension questions. I want when the kids have finished reading this, the teacher to ask, what is a glacier, or what does it mean that the oil seeps into the oceans? I want to talk about those kinds of things and how they figured them out. And if they didn't figure them out, I want to go back and weigh those clues and so on. So the notion is not always pre-teaching the words, not always trying to teach words as thoroughly as we do some words, but focusing very heavily on how do you use morphology, how do you use context, when do you need to use a dictionary or some other reference source to figure out the word, and certainly when it's needed, pre-teaching some of the words as well, but words that are going to help, not words that we just thought were important. I want to switch categories. We're running out of time fast. Sentence structure. I see a lot of vocabulary work in schools. I see a lot of background knowledge emphasis in comprehension. Not always the emphasis I'd like to see in those two areas, but lots of attention. I don't see as much attention to sentence structure. In fact, it's pretty rare that I see any. This is a high school example, but I've got some other ones in a moment. 2 sentences here. Explain clearly using at least 3 different reasons or drawing 3 diagrams why McClellan lost the battle. Or explain clearly why McClellan lost the battle. Give at least 3 reasons or draw 3 diagrams. Most people will tell you that they think the second one of those examples is easier to understand than the first one. And I think they're right. I think if this was a long enough text and you could run it through Lexiles or some other readability scheme, what you would find is, oh, wow, kids could understand the second one better than the first one. And I think that's fine. But I think what we've had a tendency to do in our selection of text is to say, wow, that first kind of text would be hard for our kids to understand. Let's not use that one. Let's use the simpler one. The first one is actually in perfectly clear, legal, standard English form, and we should be teaching kids how to understand that kind of a sentence. Reading requires more than an ability to make sense of word meanings. You have to make sense of the sentences as well. Academic texts have much more challenging syntactic forms and relations than conversation or non-academic texts, so this can take some real instruction. Here's a sentence that I lifted out of a reading book. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. My hunch is a lot of boys and girls are going to have trouble with this sentence. It's 25 words long. It has 5 commas, lots of internal punctuation. That usually complicates things. It's got an acronym. It's using caps to show us something, and it has parentheses. Those kinds of things can make a sentence difficult. One of the things that I might do is show kids how to break a sentence like that down. Now, let me just step back for a moment and say, let's say the kids were being asked to read this whole text or some part of it. Let's say I've asked them to read a fairly long page here, and then we're going to talk about it. What I would do is I wouldn't give them any kind of pre-help with this sentence. I know that sentence is in there. I think they're going to have trouble with it. I'm going to lie in wait. So I assign the reading, the kids read the section of the text, and now I'm going to ask questions, just like you would normally ask questions. What I might do is ask them something like, what did the IAU do? Or who was the IAU? Something like that, to see if they understood the sentence. If they can answer those kinds of questions, they probably understood it. It was complicated syntax, but they got it anyway, and there's nothing for me to do. There's another possibility that the kids won't be able to answer my question because they skimmed over that part because they couldn't make sense of the sentence. In which case, we're going to go back and we're going to look at the sentence again. And there are different things I might do to it, but one thing I might do is break it down for the kids. And this I might put up on, project it to the kids, but we might just mark up a text. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies from around the world, made an announcement. Just to give you a sense of why this sentence is so complicated, is there a verb in that sentence? And of course there is. The word made is the verb, but look where the verb is. It's almost at the end of the sentence. This is something that over the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years, verbs in the English language are migrating farther and farther into the sentences, which, especially in science text, which makes it harder and harder to understand it for English speakers. And nobody seems to be teaching kids about this so that they, start identifying those nouns or those verbs or whatever. Another way I might go at that same thing is I might have the kids read that sentence and reread it again and again. Who was that sentence about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they do that? Having kids, kind of by brute force work through those sentences. Another example, quick example on this. The women of Montgomery, both young and older, would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet trimming, or something to make the ladies look festive. Now, of course, by reading those aloud, I'm putting pauses in, I'm making those understandable. Kids don't know how to do that. This is a 44-word sentence that has 2 commas and an em dash. So one thing I might do is again, I'll ask a question about that. What did the women of Montgomery do? If they can't answer, we're going to go back and break down the sentence. A lot of times when there's information between 2 commas like this, it's an extra idea. So let's get that out of there and set it aside for the moment. And now we've simplified that sentence a little bit. Another thing we might do is find places to break this sentence, and breaking at ands, ors, buts can be really helpful. We've got a lot. We have 1 punctuation mark, the em dash, and we have lots of ors, so we can break those up, which starts to show kids how to read this. They don't know how to do stuff like that. Really complicated one is at the very beginning here. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. That's an independent clause. Or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch. A lot of times they're going to have trouble with that dependent clause. There's no subject to it. It isn't clear where that goes, but in fact, you have to connect it up to the women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. Or the women of Montgomery would come in with their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch. And so some kids are going to need one kind of help, some are going to need another. You look for particularly long sentences, internal punctuation, dependent clauses, all that kind of thing. Let me give you one more, and then I think I have to stop for questions. Teaching cohesion. Texts aren't just lists of sentences like that. The ideas in text are connected within and across sentences. Text can be hard because the relationships and the connections may be unclear to readers. And so we look at this one. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it. Or the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Now, this is from a research study, and they used these 2 sentences to see if there was any difference in students' ability to comprehend these 2 sentences. And in fact, there was striking differences, especially for second language students. The reason is we connect ideas in English a number of ways. In this case, sometimes we do it with a synonym, sometimes we do it with a pronoun, sometimes we do it through repetition. And so the first one, the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it. Penguin and prey have to get connected or you won't make sense of this. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Ah, that's easier to understand because the connection I have to make there is repeated. Uh, Difficulties can come from how subtle the connections are, how far apart they are, whether they're ambiguous. There's other potential choices in there, and so we do things like this. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun and coolest at its outer edge. As the disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. It pulled and tugged at bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. That paragraph is very hard to understand. If I ask kids, what is the scientific process that's being explained there, described there, a lot of fifth graders would not get that. And this is from a fifth grade text. The reason they wouldn't get it is they don't know how to make the connections across the ideas in the text. And so let's just take a quick look at this and I'll quit. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. The nebula forms a large flat ring around the sun. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around the new flat sun. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun and coolest at its outer edge. And as the disk swirled around the sun's gravity, you have to make all those connections. And then we have to do the same thing with the ring, a large flat ring. This ring, a protoplanetary disk, the disk or ring was hottest where the ring or disk was closest to the sun and coolest at the ring's outer edge. And as the disk or ring swirled around the sun, then we get down to the sun's gravity. What happens here is it is used so many times to explain different things, you get lost in it. And this is my favorite one. The bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas came together in, the synonym here is clumps of material, and what they've become are the planets. When you go through it like that and work through each of those ideas, kids start to get the idea, one, of how to read this kind of a text, but also they get the comprehension. They didn't have it initially. We didn't try to put them in a text where they'd already comprehend it. We didn't tell them what it said ahead of time so that they could read this and not understand it, but then repeat back what we'd told them. Now we're going to show kids how to comprehend it, not just try to enable comprehension. And with that, I think I'd better stop. And so I'm going to stop screen sharing and come back to see you. And Lauren, tell me that we have some questions that I can spend a few minutes on.
Yes, we have a ton of questions. So I'm glad we have a few minutes. And thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. You shared so much insight with all the educators joining us today. There was great conversation in the chat about what you shared, and many are exchanging emails to share their own resources based on things that you've said. So what a wonderful presentation, and we're so glad you're able to join us today. So yes, let's jump into our question portion. We had a bunch of questions come in. We won't get a chance to go to all of them, but let's jump in. Raquel asked, what are your thoughts on the movement to personalized instruction? Is that modern day level reading?
It very well might be. I haven't seen great research supporting what's referred to as personalized reading, but is really more of a, I'm so old. I remember a program that had SRA cards. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that, but essentially they were these cards, color-coded cards that kids could work at their levels and go off by themselves and read and answer questions. Some kids like those, some kids hate those. To me, something like reading comprehension is more of a. It's not just an individual act; it's a social act. So the idea of kind of peeling kids off to each go work on their own computer and so on. A little bit of time on those kinds of things is fine, but you also want lots of opportunities for kids to discuss this kind of thing, for the kinds of interactions that I was just sort of demonstrating to you. Yeah, so I'm hopeful that maybe some of those systems will be beneficial someday. I don't think we're quite there yet. Yeah, I'd be cautious. Go slow with that.
Fair enough. Lenita asked, in schools where independent reading is still an emphasis, how would you suggest teachers go about supporting text selection for students if it's not providing leveled text?
This is an interesting one. When we look at the texts that boys and girls pick on their own, they tend to pick books that studies say are at their frustration level, which is fascinating. I was never surprised about that with really low readers. You kind of expect that. If you have a fourth grader who can't read at a fourth grade level, but he's still going to have the interest of a fourth grade. He's still going to be a 9-year-old and have all of the same, maturity or immaturity of any 9-year-old. And so it isn't a shock that, wow, this kid reads at a second grade level and he's trying to read a fourth grade book. But what you're going to find is that fourth grader who reads at a fifth grade level is probably going to put themselves in a sixth or a seventh grade book. In other words, kids are aspirational in their reading. And one of the things that enables them, well, two of the things that enable them to make sense of those harder books, one is they have an interest in it, and interest often means they have more prior knowledge about it, so it connects up to them more easily. And two, they're motivated to do it. Think of all the boys and girls that tried to read the Harry Potter books and just fought and fought and fought to read them, despite having lower reading levels than that. So my feeling is when kids are, going to do reading on their own, give them a lot of latitude in making those choices and have these kinds of discussions. Are you actually able to read that? Were you able to figure it out? Can I help you in any way? Could we show you something in instruction that might help you? But let kids take on those harder things that they're often interested in. Also stress the difference between reading and looking at the pictures, because there are times kids take those harder books and then they don't really try to read them. And that isn't a good use of that time either. So those are some ideas.
Great ideas to share. Thank you. And Barbara asked, what should we do with the level text that we already have in our schools or classrooms?
This is a fascinating one. I've heard of schools destroying their leveled texts and getting rid of their leveled texts. If you look at the kinds of leveling, say, that Fountas and Pinnell did, the only levels that we have to worry about when it comes to teaching reading are those very beginning levels. Their beginning reading levels don't pay very much attention to decodability. They don't really set kids up very well for recognizing words. They use things like predictable text that really kind of tell kids you don't have to use the words very much. You can kind of ignore those and depend more on the pictures and so on. Even those books have a use. I often use those kinds of books to support early writing, since they're not very useful for teaching beginning reading. But for the most part, those leveled books, there's nothing wrong with the books themselves beyond the beginning levels. It's just, all books have levels. It's just that instead of trying to match kids up to those levels, I think the smartest thing you can do if you're a third grade teacher, any kid who's beyond that first grade level of decoding, teach them with the third grade book. Some kids are going to need more support than others. That's where the differentiation comes into. The differentiation shouldn't come from different books. It should come from different supports. And so some kids might not need very much support with that third grade book. And you can, set up all kinds of schemes for them to work a bit more independently of the teacher. Some kids are going to need much more substantial support. Perhaps you'll want to do fluency work with that text before the kids read it for comprehension, for example. There are studies that show that if kids go through and read a text once aloud, when they go through to read it a second time, the number of errors they make falls as much as 50%. So you might be taking a book that, gee, without that pre-reading would be frustration level, but because we had them read it once first, now they're at an instructional level or closer to it, and so we've scaffolded them up a level. So yeah, I would definitely not get rid of my leveled readers, but I would kind of match those levels to my grade level, and go from there.
Yeah, I love that. There's definitely different uses we can use for those books that we already have in our classrooms or in our schools, as opposed to throwing them out for sure. We're almost coming to the top of the hour, so let's do one more question and then we'll wrap up. Jessica has a great, interesting question. What do you think about AI and how it will play a role in supporting literacy?
Wow, AI is both kind of wonderful and kind of scary. I've been playing with a little bit in my own work, and I was in fact doing a search for some research studies, and I told it what I was looking for to see if I'd missed anything, and it cited 3 studies that the titles of which were just right on the money of what I was trying to find, and they were studies I didn't know. And I was just amazed. And then I went and looked for the studies, and they didn't exist. It had made it up. It had lied. Oh, so I suggest that we need to be careful. The hope for AI is for that kind of personalized learning that somebody had asked about earlier. We could get to a position where some of the kind of scaffolding I was just showing you could be perhaps done by a computer, and that kids could spend some of their reading time, actually interacting with a computer, where the computer is asking them questions or having them read parts of the text aloud, and then showing them, how to do particular things. We're not there, but that would be a hope for the long run. And we have to kind of be cautious though of AI, because it does have this propensity to do things like lie to people, which is a very
Def-
odd for a machine to do.
Definitely interesting the role that AI is playing in our modern day society, and see where it goes forward with.
Absolutely. Can I just say one last thing before we
Of
close
course.
this up? Uh, Folks, as much as I'm pushing the idea of the real teaching has to come with challenging text, don't get the idea that all text that we use for instruction has to be really hard for the kids or really blow the kids away. That is not a reasonable idea. I think we're better off actually using a mix of levels with kids rather than trying to get them to their level. And so the notion of, gee, we worked with a couple of easy texts, and now we're going to work with a really hard one, and now we're going to ease off a little bit, and then we'll do a couple of hard ones. It's much more like that than it is, wow, let's make sure everybody is at the level J or something like that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shanahan. This was such a wonderful presentation. We're so glad you're able to join us today, especially with your upcoming travels over the next few months. And thank you to everyone that joined us live today. And I want to remind everyone that you'll be receiving an email with the recording and a certificate of attendance. And we have so much more information to share. We have a webinar again today at noon Eastern, as well as one more webinar tomorrow to culminate our data takeover week. So feel free to join us at amplify.com/data takeover week. And thank you so much again, Dr. Shanahan, to our live attendees. We're so glad everyone was able to join us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.